Good morning. I'm Barry Mayfield with the Cabinet, and it's my privilege to get to work with your panelists this morning. I'd like to welcome you to this first panel composed of members of the Cabinet's executive leadership team. They're here to talk with you about pressing federal and state issues. At the end of the discussion, there will be time for you to ask questions. You can either do it through the app, or you can come to the mics, one on either end, so all of us can hear what you have to say. So I should note that if you're following the agenda, there is a panelist who's listed who is not here today, and our Deputy Secretary, John Lyons, has agreed to step in. He will not speak, I don't think, about Public Service Commission issues, but he does serve as the Secretary's proxy on the electric generation siting board, so he will talk about large-scale solar and kind of give you an update on that. And Linda Bridwell is scheduled to be here tomorrow on that panel. So we'll get started. Thank you. We'll start with you, Tony. Tony is at the far end. He's Commissioner of the Department for Environmental Protection. Nationwide, and especially in Kentucky, we've seen a lot of articles about PFAS. Most of us know those, if you've ever heard of it, as forever chemicals. And the Federal Environmental Protection Agency announced that it is doing an analysis, about a 2-year study, and then they expect by the end, I think, of December 2024 to establish some standards for a couple of those chemicals. The Cabinet initiated on its own a study, and we've looked at drinking water and also at fish tissue. So Tony, would you give our audience an update on that, please?
Sure. First off, I would like to say, following up on the Governor's comments and Secretary Goodman's, for all the DEP staff that are here and aren't here, we value each and every one of you, and I consider it a privilege to be your colleagues. And for those of you who are here specifically, who were engaged in our response actions in Mayfield and over in Eastern Kentucky, I can't tell you how thankful I am to have such good, qualified people who care about what they do. Y'all are outstanding. I love every one of you. So,
Thank you, Tony.
That's easy for me to say because that's absolutely true. But PFAS, or per or polyfluoroalkylated substances, I mean, it's really hard and difficult maybe to determine where to start, but I'll talk about it in real general terms. So these are compounds and chemicals that are common in a lot of different consumer products, from food packaging to things like Scotchgard, across the board. It's present in a lot of different consumer products, and therefore it's likely to be present in a lot of different places as a result of its manufacture and use. I think recently, not necessarily recently, in the last few years, there's been a lot of developments and conversations about the public health impacts of PFAS in the human body and in environmental media that we may be getting exposed to. So I think as was mentioned, EPA is in the process now of determining what federal rules they might implement for environmental protection purposes. I think one of the first things we may see is a promulgation of a maximum contaminant level, or an MCL, for drinking water purposes for at least 2 of these compounds. They're going to be present, and we have found them to be present in almost all the surface source waters in this state at very low concentrations. They are somewhat ubiquitous. Depending on where you're at, they may be higher concentrations. But when they become MCLs, then drinking water facilities will be required to comply with meeting those standards, which once that standard gets set, we'll all know a little bit more about how challenging that's going to be. I think we can expect that it will impact the cost of water to our citizens. It's going to be a challenging thing to do. We know that there has been success using granular activated carbon. However, there's a need to replenish that consistently to keep up with that, so that adds to the. It's not all about cost, it's also about public protection, but that's going to be a challenge for a lot of our drinking water facilities and our staff. A couple other things that we understand the EPA might actually list some of these as hazardous substances under the federal Superfund program. That's a much more far-reaching, has much more far-reaching implications, not only in public health, but on the economic side of things. If something becomes listed as a hazardous substance, and if you manage or release that to the environment, you might be subject to liability under a federal Superfund program. So they recently were considering promulgating those standards and applying them to certain types of facilities or activities that we know produce or may manage those particular types of compounds. What it basically going to boil down to, here's the way that I look at it, and here's the philosophy that the cabinet has taken, which I think is a sound one. If a hazardous substance listing takes place, that means that we may have numerous sites across the Commonwealth that are subject to liability under federal and state Superfund laws. However, while that is an issue, that is going to be a very difficult thing to identify and implement. Our primary concern right now is making sure that we have a good idea of what our citizens are exposed to when they finish drinking water in the state. That's why we have and will continue to do analysis of drinking water facilities across the state. We've invested a considerable amount of money in our state lab to purchase equipment to be able to do that, because those types of analysis are incredibly expensive, and we could not afford to do it if we had to rely on third-party laboratories. So, I want to shout out to our folks in the lab. They do an outstanding job, and they make it so we can do what we're doing. So we're going to continue to do drinking water surveys, source water surveys, and fish tissue monitoring as we continue into the future. Also in our waste programs, we're doing some sampling at certain types of sites to see if we can just get an idea of what we have and where it's at. At the end of the day, I think we need to concentrate on the exposure piece of it, which is our drinking water and fish tissue and things such as that. Otherwise, it's going to be the biggest, most impactful legislation in your classic air, water, and waste programs that we've ever seen before, and I'm pretty confident about that. So that's a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of what we're doing right now, Barry.
Thank you, Tony.
Mm-hmm.
Next, Gordon Slone is Commissioner of the Department for Natural Resources, and one of those resources that you regulate is coal and coal mining. And there's been a slight, if maybe modest, uptick in coal production, in expansion of mines, and some in employment. Will you give us an update about that, please?
Sure. Thank you, Barry. Let me just go ahead and tell you just a little bit about myself. I am from Martin County, Kentucky, which is in the eastern Kentucky coal fields. I've worked in an underground mine. A lot of my family has also been in the mining industry. So to me, it's personal. So when I talk about it, it's personal to me, and I hope it's interesting to you. So in the coal industry, especially in Kentucky, especially the eastern Kentucky region, we had a pretty good industry going from about the mid-1970s until somewhere in the 2010s or thereabouts. But Kentucky coal competes with other forms of energy, such as natural gas, oil. So it's not the only form of energy out there. So as those other types of energy have gained prominence in different ways, we in Eastern Kentucky especially have to compete for that. So pardon me while I've got a lot of numbers, and I apologize that I have to refer to my notes. But in about 2014, that's when, and here goes to Kenya. Kenya keeps our records for the Energy and Environment Cabinet for the coal, employment, production, eastern versus western Kentucky. So I rely a lot on her numbers. So in 2014 is when we started to see a decline in employment in eastern Kentucky. In 2020, that was the year COVID really struck. That we went down below 4,000 miners in the state for the first time. Post-COVID, there's been a slight increase in production and employment. So last year I started tracking the spot price for Kentucky steam coal, Eastern Kentucky steam coal, and about a year ago it was around $75 a ton. Since then, it had, for different reasons, it's gone up. Now it's about $205 a ton. looking at that number in a vacuum, you think, wow, that's really good. A lot of people should be getting into the coal industry. But as I said, coal is just a form of energy. It competes against natural gas. It competes against oil. And also there are a lot of economic issues that run into it. So production-wise, let me just throw some more numbers at you. In 2019, before COVID, and I'm doing apples to apples, we've got the numbers, Kenya has, for the second quarter of 2022. So for the second quarter of 2019, we had produced 19.7 million tons. But then COVID hit. In 2020, the second quarter, we only had 11.6 million tons produced in Kentucky. Last year, we started to see that uptick, Barry, that you mentioned. 13.1, still lower than pre-COVID million tons, but slowly creeping back out. So by the end of the second quarter of this year, we are up to 14.1 million tons across Kentucky. In employment, let me go back to 2009. That's the last time we really had really good employment. So we had about 19,000 employees in 2009. Fast forward to 2020, again, second quarter, we had about 3,800 people employed in the Kentucky coal industry. This year, we've jumped up quite a bit. Remember, we had 3,800 last year about this time, and now we're up to 4,500, almost 4,600. So, Kenya, thank you for all those numbers. So, Barry, I'd say we have an uptick, and it's great for the coal industry in eastern Kentucky. It's not a boom, not by any stretch, but if you look back over the, like I said, from the 70s through the mid-2010s or so, it's not a lot, but it's better than it was, especially after COVID.
Thank you. We'll turn next to our guest panelist, our surprise panelist, Deputy Secretary Lyons. As I mentioned earlier, he serves on the Electric Generation and Transmission Siting Board. And I've asked John if he would share with us, because there's a lot of interest all across the state, varies from community to community, because we think it is a local issue, and that's the siting of large-scale solar. So, John, would you give us just kind of an update on, because there's been, over almost 30 filings before the siting board?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. And before I get started, I just did want to say how great it is to see everybody in person, colleagues, friends, and coworkers. We've come a long way to get here today, and I really appreciate seeing everybody, and I look forward to saying hi to a lot of people I haven't seen in a long time. So great to see everybody. As Barry said, I do serve as the Secretary's proxy on the siting board. It's been quite an experience, to be honest. I didn't know what to expect when I got into it. It's been a lot of work. It has kind of slowed down now. There has been about 30 projects filed. The siting board has issued construction certificates for about 20 of those projects. Sorry, I don't have the exact numbers. I didn't have my spreadsheet available to me before I came up on the stage, so you'll have to take my word for it on that. That's kind of where it's at. But obviously, this has been a hotbed topic for some time. There was legislation filed in the past session to address some of the issues that are really paramount to these projects. And you got to remember, these projects are anywhere from 60 megawatts to up to 200 megawatts in size, and that translates into a lot of land that's needed to build these projects. To my knowledge, none of them have started construction yet. I haven't been able to confirm that. Some of the earlier projects that were done, there was a couple, may have started construction, but I have not been able to confirm that. I would actually like to get boots on the ground and see these being constructed and to see how it's going, because we do a fairly elaborate order from the siting board to grant these certificates with a lot of different parameters that these developers have to meet. Some of those are like noise. I know we placed a lot of emphasis on noise issues. These racks that these solar panels go on, they literally drive the steel piling to the ground a certain distance. So, albeit it might be a short construction time frame, that's going to cause considerable noise for the folks that live nearby. So we have focused on that. We require noise studies and to measure the decibels that may be in proximity to the closest neighbor or church or school, and pay particular attention to that. One of the other topics that we really focus on is sight lines or view sheds. Everybody's seen probably a solar field at some point in time, but think to yourself, would you like to live adjacent to one and see that solar field for the next 30 years or 40 years in front of your house? Along with that, we do impact studies on house valuation in terms of residential value. I can tell you that most of those studies all conclude that there is no impact on home values. And those are pretty extensive studies that have been done across the country from that respect. Obviously, one of the big issues, and probably the biggest issue, is land use. Now, I won't say that there have been a whole lot of the projects that have gotten opposition, but there's probably been 4 or 5, particularly where you are using prime agricultural land for these projects. And you got to understand these people are getting a lease agreement, and I'm not at the liberty to divulge those prices per acre, but they see fit to lease these projects out to these developers. And in the meanwhile, there's prime agricultural land, and that's a big concern for the agricultural community. We've seen opposition in 2 or 3 counties that really is focused on that. And as a member of the board, I appreciate it because I have a farm myself, and I have to think, would I like to see solar panels on my farm when I'm the 4th generation owner of that land? And I can tell you personally, I wouldn't probably do that. But for other people, when they can make more money on these projects than they can doing row crops or cattle or hay, it's a question of economics for some of these folks. So that is probably one of the biggest things that we're facing. We have a quarterly meeting with Farm Bureau, and I'd like to say, and I'd like to give the Secretary and President of Farm Bureau credit for putting that group together, because in my 33 years in this cabinet, I don't know that we've ever had a closer relationship to that association and the issues surrounding agricultural matters that we deal with a lot, not just the solar issue, but in water and waste, we deal with agriculture on a large scale. And those meetings have been really good for us to meet with them and to talk over these issues and issues that are going to come up again in the next legislative session. So we have seen a little bit of local opposition, and we expect to see more of that. We have a few projects left to do at this point. The developers are sometimes slow to come along and file and get the ball rolling in terms of the siting board hearing the cases, but we typically, they're about a 180-day statutory time frame that we have to run through these projects, have testimony, get all the evidence, do siting criteria. We go out and actually go to the site. Mainly the commission staff do that, and they're a great deal of help to the siting board in terms of looking over all this evidence and giving the siting board the information we need to make a decision in the end. The last thing I'll mention, and it's probably one of the other bigger things beside land use that you'll see in legislation, is decommissioning. These projects can be in the ground 30 to 40 years. And everybody's wondering, all right, when that time frame ends, who's going to be there to ensure that these panels are properly disposed of and that the land is returned back to its former use? There's a lot of arguments surrounding that. Can you ever return it back to its former use if you grade an agricultural field and take off the topsoil is one thing, but the other is really the recycling component of the panels. A lot can change in 3 or 4 decades, as we all know, and new issues come to light. We're just really dealing with one kind of panel at this point, but there's new technologies out there that may have heavier metals in the panels. A lot of people think that these panels leach out into the environment. They don't unless they're damaged in some way, and even then they do not have any type of liquid inside of them to actually leak out, but they do have heavy metal components. So I think that's the legislation we're going to see again, Barry, as you probably well know, and we expect to see that come up again this next session, and we'll do it all over again. So that's kind of an overview of what the siting board has done on the solar project.
Thank you, John, and thanks for filling in this
Absolutely.
morning. Kenya, good morning.
Good morning, Barry.
Kenya Stump is the Executive Director of the Office of Energy Policy, the keeper of stats. But what she is going to start out this morning, she's going to talk about something that we see everywhere we turn, and that's rising energy prices, and globally, locally, and what that will mean for our home utility bills. Kenya?
Can you all hear me? Just wanted to make sure I'm on. I did see there are a few questions, and Gordon, if you want me to take a few of these questions before I address that, Barry, if you don't mind. So back to coal, 95% of Kentucky coal remains in the United States. I see that question. 5% is exported to foreign markets. Yes, there is a question about carbon sequestration. As we look into a carbon-constrained future, and as we look to keeping our baseload fossil sources online, that would require advancements in carbon capture and sequestration and utilization. The infrastructure bill has a significant amount of funding going to CCUS. I see Dr. Andrews is in the room, Rodney Andrews in the back. They're one of our strategic partners as it relates to our ability to harness carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. And we're also working with Midwestern states on how we all can work together on moving that forward. So yes, CCUS is one tool in our toolbox, as we're going to have to figure out how our baseload sources remain online for that more resilient grid. The other question, yes, if you're interested in hydrogen, Ms. Ramirez will be talking about that tomorrow on our Tech Talk panel. We have a great partner with NiSource, Louisville Gas and Electric, and Kentucky Utilities are all exploring how we're going to utilize hydrogen in the future. But back to affordability, Barry, yes, one of our focus areas at the Office of Energy Policy is affordability. We're blessed that we have great partnerships with all of our utilities, as well as our associations that represent our fuel commodities. So in the room today, I know we have our electric utilities. Kentucky Petroleum Marketers Association is in the room. We also work with the Propane Association, as well as API, and of course our natural gas utilities as well. But yes, as we go into winter, we are seeing that customers will bear the burden of what we're seeing in terms of fuel increases. We strategically formed an affordability work group a few years ago, which is a partnership with our nonprofits, our utilities, as well as Cabinet for Health and Family Services, Community Action, United Way. It's been a very strategic partnership in that it's helped us see how we can work together to make sure that those most in need can find the resources to help with their affordability issues. When we look at affordability, we look at energy burden as one metric, and that's the percentage of your income that you spend on your energy bills. For most of Kentucky, that's around 6%. But in our most vulnerable populations, that can reach 11% and even upwards to 20 to 25%. So at that point, you're making decisions about food, medicine, and can I pay my bills? And it's a very complex issue when we talk about affordability. It's not just about price, it's about consumption, it's about income, it's about economic development in those counties that are most vulnerable. So what we really are working towards with this focus group is how do we tackle all of these issues, knowing that no one industry or source is really to blame because it's such a complex issue, spanning housing. Affordable, energy-efficient housing is one of our toughest challenges that we face into the future, as well as our manufactured housing stock. Often those, okay, getting some feedback. Often those that face the highest energy burden are those that are living in old, manufactured, inefficient housing. That leads to greater consumption and greater percentage of your income devoted to paying your energy bills. So going into winter, we'll be coming out with resources and hopefully working on ways that we can make sure that people are directed to the resources in the most efficient way and that they can get the help that they need as soon as possible.
Thank you, Kenya. I'm going to change this up just a little bit because Kenya led me to this, and I appreciate that. I'm going to confess, first of all, that because of my age and the fact that I need cataract surgery, I can't see the questions from here. So, I will stand up later to see them, but as Kenya did, if the other panelists, if there are questions popping up that apply to your area and you want to go on and answer them as we go along, that's a great way to do it.
There's a couple, Barry, that I can see from here. I think I can see regarding solar.
Okay.
Is there potential for solar project sites to have dual land use and incorporate pollinator habitat restoration and/or plantings? That's a great question, something I didn't touch upon. The siting board does encourage, although it's not required anywhere in the statutes that they have dual land use or incorporate pollinator habitat or species. But most developers do that voluntarily. They at least have a couple of acres of pollinator habitat. Nothing like you'll see at the KU Brown solar development over in near Bergen. They have about 7 acres over there, and most of that was pollinator habitat. The secretary and myself and several other folks visited over there earlier in, when was that, Secretary? Was that last year or this year? I can't remember.
Last year.
And they also had sheep grazing over there as well, which is, I know is a particular pet project of the Secretary's. She has really pushed that dual land use aspect of that, along with agricultural things like sheep grazing. And we've met with the sheep association in the state. And seen and tried to incorporate that into this. It remains to be seen how much of that will be done, but we certainly do look at those pollinator aspects. I think there was one other question that's similar to that, if I can find it. Is there anything in place to protect or offset the potential land loss of nature and historic grassland habitat due to large solar projects? Thank you for that question. I do work with Sonny Carr and Nature Preserve folks. When it's evident that a project may be in one of those areas where we had historic grasslands, prairie species that are endangered or no longer exist, we required one project specifically to use those native grasses on their project in terms of, instead of pollinators, but traditional pollinators you might buy at a wild seed store. We had them use the native grasses instead on that particular project. So where we know that exists, we try to do that. Along with, along with that, I've worked with Brandon Howard and Forestry on using native species for screening purposes outside the fence line instead of some of the evergreen species that the developers wanted to use. We've asked them to use eastern red cedar or other conifers that are native to Kentucky in that respect. One other question I saw.
I can take that one, John, if you
The
want.
bourbon one?
Well, no, I was going to take the brownfield one. Oh,
Well, there's one on a dual use on bourbon industry as well. Can solar panel developments be paired with bourbon aging rick houses to help solve the land use concerns for both industries? That would be a great idea. I don't know that you ever get the bourbon industry to agree to that. But yes, there's a lot of rooftop space. You can see it from the 300 building over across the river at one of at Buffalo Trace. They have built a lot of rick houses. That's a great idea. I think, Secretary, we might want to take that forward and see if we can get any traction on that. So.
And I'll take the brownfield question, well, mainly because Tony and I are sitting side by side. What incentives are being provided to encourage merchant solar development on brownfield sites? So first, I'd like to draw attention to, we did a GIS project where we were looking at site suitability on Kentucky's reclaimed mine lands. That's a great tool for finding locations that you may not have thought about in terms of solar development. And we do have a large-scale project that was approved in East Kentucky. But as it relates to brownfields, I think the best answer to that question is the example that you're going to hear about tomorrow, and that's from Lexmark. Tony and I have probably spent 6 years or more working with Lexmark on the solar project that was unveiled earlier this year. It's a great example of it was actually an active hazardous waste remediation site, and we worked cooperatively with Lexmark with the help of Commissioner Hatton and his folks to help get processes in place, streamlined, so that Lexmark was able to meet their sustainability goals by using a piece of property that the only thing it was good for was putting some solar panels on. They're ballasted panels, and I encourage you to speak to John Gagel tomorrow about that as well. That's just a terrific example of how we worked with our permitting folks. We worked with economic development. We worked with the utility serving Lexmark for many, many years to help them bring a project to completion, because it's important to them, because it helps them in their competitiveness in terms of what their stakeholders and customers want. And that's what we call energy economic development. It's supporting energy development, but also supporting our existing businesses that want to expand and meet their goals. Tony, do you want to talk about brownfield incentives maybe?
Well, I would say that brownfields has a real general term. A brownfield is an area where you might think there's real or perceived contamination, and then there are brownfield sites that have a regulatory connections because they may have Superfund liability. All brownfield sites aren't created equal. When you're looking at the type of solar development, you're looking at a piece of property where you have some sizable acreage, and so there are some of those sites in the traditional DEP programs where you might have a facility that has a large buffer area that would be available for solar development, perhaps. The abandoned mines is a good opportunity. You have the issue with stability that comes along with that. But if a situation arose where someone wanted to develop a brownfield site but had concerns about taking ownership of that facility for whatever reason, in Kentucky we do have, in addition to our program we'll talk about here a little bit later, how we work with locals, we do have what I'd consider a top shelf brownfields liability program in Kentucky that's been in place since 2012. And we have seen a lot of progress with that, a lot of economic development opportunities come about. So irrespective of what you intend to do with a piece of property, for the most part, irrespective of what you intend to do. If there's a piece of property that suits your needs, and we're always willing to work with folks who are interested in obtaining properties for whatever it is they might want to do with those properties in the future. Just I think in this particular case, you're looking at probably some minimum acreage requirements. So there's sites out there.
Yeah. And that's the great thing about energy being in the environment cabinet is that I get to work with Gordon as his data person. And then with the PSC and Tony and his folks on a whole host of issues. Back to agrivoltaics, I'm just going to jump in. With our infrastructure funding, we are exploring a project with the University of Kentucky where we would study cattle grazing around solar array. Our cattle industry is particularly interested in this. There is a great project in Moorhead, and I believe John Cotton is here from Wilderness Trace Solar. Moorhead's cattle facility there has a very, very small array, but it's designed such that it allows for cattle grazing. We're looking to potentially explore that further with the University of Kentucky, and I never thought I would fund a cattle tracker, but to look at what does cattle grazing and solar look like, because that can really go a long way for our large-scale solar projects when we get into some areas that are known for their beef production. That's all I've got, Barry, on that one.
Thank you. Tony, you mentioned brownfields. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is bringing millions and millions of dollars to your department for water, wastewater projects, and also for brownfield. Give us kind of a preview of how that might be spent and what the process is for that.
Okay, so we were spending a lot of conversation. The Secretary in her opening remarks talked about the federal funding coming into the state and the various sundry purposes for which the state's going to receive it. I think of two primary programs that DEP will be heavily involved in. One is the use of bill funding for improving drinking water and clean water type facilities. In other words, drinking water facilities, wastewater treatment facilities. I think there's a panel coming up at 11 o'clock today which is going to discuss a lot of those specifics in detail. But just in general, I think I think the application period for the second round of funding ended just a few days ago. And I think so the first round and second rounds of funding were for in the neighborhood of $250 million for the purposes of infrastructure improvements. In Kentucky, we are blessed with a vast amount of water resources. And when you compare some of the states around, it's astounding to see how many fewer drinking water facilities we have in some of our neighboring states, because over time we've done a pretty good job of connecting ourselves where we have opportunities to do so. Like everyone else, though, we do have aging infrastructure. We have situations where a city or a municipality may want to expand. There's difficulties in pushing water out a certain distance. And just the basic reality of infrastructure ages and gets old and has containment problems. We have a fair amount of drinking water facilities in the state that produce some amount of water, and only a small percentage, or maybe 50% of that water, actually eventually reaches the consumer. It's not funny, but being a hydrogeologist, I refer to some of these as an aquifer recharge program, because there's so much water that costs the citizens money that's going straight out of the hole in the pipe. So this is a good opportunity to take these dollars, which will be administered through KIA, and the Department Division of Water will obviously be involved in this, particularly when it comes time to approve engineering plans and things such as that. I think it's a good opportunity. I think we need to wisely spend money. We're hopeful, and I think the Secretary's been spoke about this many times, and even conversations that we have together, we need to look for opportunities to encourage where we can for small municipalities to regionalize and connect themselves together. The temptation, a drinking water facility is, and I get it, it's a source of local pride. People want to produce their own drinking water. I get that. And when they could, and if they can, that's great. Sometimes it becomes a little bit more of a challenge, and programmatically and technically it makes more sense to regionalize. So I think opportunities that with this amount of funding, maybe we'll see some success with that. And also on the clean water side, wastewater treatment. For the most part, wastewater treatment for a local municipality is not nearly as likable as the drinking water side of it. Wastewater typically doesn't make money for municipalities. It's a general cost to them, but it's a good way to protect the waters of the Commonwealth when we have vast resources if we can better contain and maintain our wastewater. Wastewater and drinking water in general are going to become a little more complicated as the PFAS stuff begins to unfurl and moving forward. And secondly, I think economic development opportunities are broadened when you have reliable and plenteous resources of water. And in order for certain areas to have significant economic development opportunities, they need to have a reliable source of drinking water and how to treat their wastewater. That's important. When companies look to move into an area, they have to know they have those basic resources that they can rely on to conduct their business. Now, on the brownfield side, we sort of have, in the department, we sort of have what I'd call two different phases of our brownfield program. One strictly regulatory, where we look at potential Superfund sites and the redevelopment of those sites. And then also, we have a significant program where we assist local municipalities, quasi-government agencies with opportunities to improve conditions in their community. And oftentimes that may be an abandoned school, an abandoned hospital, or something such as that in an area of their city which is not returning any tax money. It's a blight on the community. They can become attractive nuisances for people to be around, and just an all-around not a good sustainable thing. I think over the next few years, Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, there's going to be like $1.5 billion available for brownfields redevelopment projects for cities and municipalities. We're there to help with that. I know in the last couple of months, Amanda's been out and had we've done some grant writing application processes for locals to apply for a significant amount of brownfields money to improve situation in their community. I think historically, the cap on any given project was $500,000 for assessment and cleanup. I think this next year, with this expanded amount of funding, you can apply for up to $2 million for a brownfield project. The money's there. It takes one, creativity, and two, an understanding that if you have a piece of property, particularly where that might be located, and it can have a very negative effect. We've done a lot of brownfields work in the state, and I remember one project in particular we did down in western Louisville, where we did a major cleanup down there. One of the things that the citizens that they struggled with, and I get it, and that was just looking at that site every morning when they got up and had to drive by it. Just the general, it was basically a skeleton, and so there was that view piece of it, and then there's the potential risk piece of it. Sometimes just giving somebody something better to look at, not having to look at something like that, encourages, and it also encourages and sort of primes the pump for economic development opportunities. So you have to take it a step at a time, but I would encourage anyone who's might qualify for that kind of funding, put some resources towards it, because you might be surprised what an improvement on one little piece of your city, how it might very positively affect in a lot of different ways. So there's unprecedented amount of money coming into that program. We stand ready to help. We stand ready to assist people in writing their grants. We love brownfields redevelopment as long as we do it right and responsibly, and that's what we intend to do, and that's what we've always done. So we're ready to get busy.
Thank you, Tony. Recruiting and retention, both are major challenges within our cabinet. Really, I think it's fair to say, Secretary, all across the cabinet. But I think probably nowhere is it more critical right now, Gordon, than with your mine safety teams.
Okay, so our mine safety people are spread out mostly in the eastern part of the state, but we also cover the western coal field as well. And my deputy commissioner, David Fields, is here. He's formerly been one of those mine safety specialists who go down and make sure that the mines are kept safe so that there's no possibility for an explosion, that the operators are running their machines properly and safely. There's It's been about 30 years since I went underground, and things have changed so much. They are so much safer than they were before, but the key, of course, is making sure that people comply with those safety regulations. So as far as our mining industry, Kenya, this time I got my data from the Division of Mine Safety. And let me just mention them. So Western Kentucky has 3 large mines. But those 3 large mines, when I say large, underground mines, they employ in the neighborhood of about 1,600 folks out of our about 4,500 employees in the mining industry in Kentucky. But those are just 3 mines, so they only count as 3. But we have gone down a little bit in employment. So before COVID in 2019, we had about 219 mines that were licensed here in Kentucky. In 2020, it went down, of course that was the COVID year, from 219 to 157. Again, that example of the large mines in Western Kentucky, you may have fewer mines, they may be larger, but overall in 2021 after COVID, we continued to go down from 157 to 146 actual licensed mines. This year we bumped up just a little bit. We have currently about 149 licensed mines, but out of those 149 mines, only about 93 are currently operating. There's a number of reasons why a licensed mine may not be operating. It may be shut down for repair and maintenance. There may be some problem with their workers' comp insurance. They have to shut down until they get that back. Or there may be just problems in the mine, like some mines get a lot of water in them, and you have to clear out the water before you can go back to production, things like that. So as far as personnel, we probably have the personnel to operate the mines, especially in Eastern Kentucky. But I know that our mining industry is having a hard time recruiting, especially new miners. Since the mid-2010s or so, we have gone down as far as employment, production in Eastern Kentucky, and that's had an effect on employment. So it is much more difficult for our employers to find good, qualified people. But our Division of Mine Safety trains new miners. They retrain miners every year. So we have a resource that we're proud of here in the Energy and Environment Cabinet that helps that. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. Kenya, there's a lot of talk, maybe some angst about, or at least questions about the reliability of the electric grid. That's a nationwide issue. But within our own state, what is your view of that? And also, you might want to mention that there is funding available for certain amounts of critical infrastructure, both direct funding to the federal government and some small projects through your office.
So reliability is one thing we look at in terms of how we look at our electric grid, one measure. We're very blessed in our state. We have strong diversity in our resource mix that aids that reliability. For the most part, our grid is very reliable, has been and continues to be, thanks to our utility providers. I do think there are pockets of opportunity that we've seen. And there's that. Pockets of opportunity that we've seen as it relates to the fact that we have been hit, as the Secretary mentioned, 6 times with natural disasters that really test our utility providers, but they've come through time and time and again in terms of preparation, restoration, and recovery. I think at the local government level, we have opportunities like we saw with Mayfield Electric, like we saw with some of the other smaller utilities, look at the BIL funding in terms of what you can do to add that redundancy, that self-healing capability on the distribution system. For the most part, it's the distribution system where we see reliability, what I would call instances that pop up from time to time. But to your question, Barry, if you're in the BIL funding, then you've heard of 40101D. That's our grid resilience funding. We proposed our narrative for DOE and held a public hearing on that. That's around $27 million over 5 years. It sounds big, but the minute you talk to someone who does grid work or grid projects, it's really not in terms of resilience work. And by the way, the biggest source of reliability issues is vegetation management. So we have to look at, what is the source? And a lot of the times it is vegetation management. But our plan focuses on first working with state parks. Our state parks have become critical facilities in Kentucky in terms of housing those affected by natural disasters. Those state parks have to be up and running with power and water in order to be able to serve as critical locations for those who experience impacts from a disaster. We have 5 state parks where we own our own distribution system, and that means we're going to have to look at those state parks in terms of improving that distribution system. Second, our municipal utilities, Mayfield, we saw that with Princeton, Bowling Green. Our municipal utilities need some support in terms of how can we increase their visibility into their distribution system and in terms of just strengthening and hardening their own distribution system. We did do a microgrid feasibility study. Look, microgrids are kind of sexy right now, and that's just one tool of the toolbox. We can't just jump to a microgrid if we haven't done some of the basics on the distribution system. But we know microgrids are a topic and do have applicability here in the state. Our microgrid study focused on microgrids at critical facilities and in terms of also a regional microgrid approach. So that's one area we're looking to put funding, microgrids as well, munis. And then the Secretary mentioned the importance of working with our cooperatives. We have cooperatives in TVA territory, Big Rivers to the west, and of course East Kentucky Power cooperatives. They cover a large swath of the state. It doesn't like me. And so working with our cooperatives on their distribution system as well. And in addition, working with our utilities to identify what other funding sources they will need to move forward in order to accomplish their own goals in terms of reliability. But overall, Barry, we don't have a reliability problem in the state because of our robust utility structure and our base load generation. But we do have opportunities, I think, to do some strategic improvements in locations.
Thank you. Because we have answered some questions as we've gone along, I'm going to have one final question to Tony before we open it up for questions from the floor. Tony, last year the Cabinet had a piece of legislation. It's dam safety related, and it was to mandate the creation over a period of time, with the Cabinet's help, emergency action plans for owners of high hazard and significant hazard dams. It flew through the House and hit a wall in the Senate. So there was a complication at the end. So the Cabinet, it is our primary piece of legislation for 2023. But throughout this year, there have been several challenges in communities. Marion is one of them. They're across the state, and I think I'm accurate, Tony, that none of the ones that have had challenges, either for breach or other issues, had an emergency action plan, which tended to slow the process down. Is that correct?
I think that's true, Barry. You know, it bears mentioning when you're talking about high and significant hazard dams, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a situation where you have a dam that's about to physically fail. You know, that could be the case, but also a dam meets that definition if it meets certain benchmarks with regards to who might live in the inundation zone if that dam were to fail, or to have a catastrophic failure. So there are a fair number of high and significant hazard dams that are physically in decent, reasonably good shape, but because of development beneath the dam in the inundation zone, they are considered to be high risk. The Division of Water, I guess maybe 2.5 years ago, completed their inundation zone mapping for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I think we worked with Mississippi State University. They're not super detailed inundation zone mapping, but they're adequate and good enough for the purposes for which they're being used. So that's a piece of information that we're able to pass on to local emergency responders, so they'll have an idea of where the water might go if you had a significant failure of a dam. So emergency action plans could include a lot of things, and as you have an aging infrastructure, you know, in the Department for Environmental Protection, we do emergency responses. To the extent that you can, you should always try to plan what your steps are in the event that you have a situation that arises. Now, once you get on the ground, no matter what it might be, you know, circumstances are going to be developing. It's a dynamic thing that may change the way in which you have to respond. But particularly what we've seen, Barry, and you mentioned it, it's just, I guess, coincidence, serendipity, whatever. Last year, after the bill that we had sort of hit the wall, we have had some incidences this past year where you've had municipalities that might have a dam that not only you have a concern about failure inundating, but that's also their municipal drinking water supply. And so that adds another level of critical importance. When you have a dam that holds back your water supply, in the event that it fails, you do not readily have a resource to meet that need. And we've spent a lot of time, a fair amount of time as an agency working in the city of Marion. We have some other ones that are potentially developing. I won't mention now because they haven't fully developed yet. What happens and what we saw happen, and why I think emergency action plans are important for a lot of reasons, particularly when you have a response, is that you have a basic roadmap for what you're supposed to do when what you don't want to happen actually happens. Doesn't mean you're going to follow it to a T, but you know, a situation like that where you don't really have a roadmap and you have a bunch of different people with a bunch of different expert ideas and a bunch of different approaches, then you have a little bit of chaos. Our staff did an outstanding job of sort of wading through that down in Marion. It would have been much nicer to have had a plan that you basically follow until circumstances dictate you change it. I think another really important aspect of it is it connects state level responders to local responders, and it gives the local responder a little more idea of what the situation is, where they live, if something were to occur, and what the plan actually is. That's important because we work pretty close with our local responders. I think perhaps if it comes to fruition, another part of an emergency action plan that's sort of developed as we think about it is we need to think about, in the event that you have a failure or a partial failure that compromises a drinking water source, I think emergency action plans ought to be constructed in such a way that they sort of recognize that might be the case, and you start to do some pre-planning before you get to that point where all of a sudden you have a situation there's not a clear path forward. So the legislation makes a lot of sense. There are some technical pieces of putting together an emergency action plan, and maybe all dam owners might not have that expertise. One of the things that we will do, we'll absolutely do it, is we're going to provide assistance to dam owners in terms of giving them some information that we've generated that they might otherwise have to pay an engineering firm to generate. So to keep their costs down and the necessity for them to hire outside expertise to figure out what they need to do, we're going to assist with that. And we will when the time comes, and we see a lot of value in that. So I'm hopeful that this next legislative session that we'll have that bill filed and it'll stay relatively clean all the way to the end. I think it gets to that point, you'd have to ask yourself the question, why would this be a not good piece of legislation? I mean, this is for public safety, and it really is. So,
Thank you, Tony.
yeah, absolutely.
Are there any questions from the floor? there are,
Barry,
yes.
do you mind if I circle back?
No.
So I did want to circle back while you all are thinking about some questions. On the resilience piece, our office, you'll see some uptick in our resilience work in communities beginning next year. We received a FEMA BRIC grant, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities grant. That's due to Amanda LeMaster on my staff. We're going to be working in all of the ads to connect our critical facilities to a better understanding of what fuels and energy sources they're dependent on, to get them thinking about, well, what happens if I'm without that for longer than 36 hours or 48 hours? What's my plan? Do I have fuel contingency plans in place? Can I refuel? How do I work with my electric utility provider to ensure that I have redundancy or that I'm on the priority restoration list? What we've seen in the past 3 years, the definition of critical facility is expanded beyond what we thought was critical, which was hospitals, water, wastewater. We saw during the past disasters, Barry, that we could make water, but we couldn't pump it anywhere. We had wastewater processing capabilities, but could we get the water to where it needed to be processed? So daycares became critical, pharmacies. If you're from a small town, Walmart and the one gas station is critical to keeping that community operating, or the Home Depot. So we're going to be expanding our conversation around critical facility preparedness, but that's going to be a conversation with our fuel suppliers and our electric providers with those communities to talk about how do we look at our hazard mitigation plans with our emergency response plans at the community level, and making sure you can answer the question, do you have a list of critical facilities? Can those critical facilities stay up and running? And can you keep your community lifelines green when we have an energy disruption? Right now, we don't have clear answers on those questions in our communities. So you're going to see our office ramp up our work around critical facilities in the next couple of years.
Thank you. If you have no questions now and think of them later, our panelists will be around during the break and later in the day. Please just ask your question just one-on-one. Would you join me in thanking our panelists, please? It's now time for a break.